comes to suicide deaths, which is a very sensitive topic, also in India, with all recent changes in the penal code, etc. But we found, for example, we read in the report from the National Crime Records Bureau that, for example, in the state of Bihar, it was 0.6 people per lakhs that committed suicides. 0.6 in comparison to Kerala, where it was 28 people per lakhs.
People see it as something shameful. Also, if a family member would commit suicide, is something to be very ashamed of. And that makes it very difficult, of course, for people who have suicidal ideations to even discuss it. So
hide their problems for other people because they are ashamed and, well, everything that comes with stigma. And also, for example, families don't want to disclose that one of the family members is suffering from, let's say, psychotic episodes, because that's rather intrusive and that would kind of a negative effect on the family. So
kind of tend to forget and don't really address in our Western treatments is religion. So religion seems to be a separate thing for us, like we don't really incorporate it in the treatments, whereas there's also some really nice examples out there where they show that you can incorporate religious beliefs or spirituality within the treatments, and that seems to, well, it seems to be works like better for certain contexts because you take into account people's values.
In the Western world, for the past many decades, it's considered to be very healthy to disclose about yourself. If something's on your chest, and sometimes people feel it literally on their chest, if something on the chest, you have to get rid of it. Whereas in large parts of the world, and maybe even in most parts of the world, disclosing about yourself is kind of putting a burden on your family, on your community. So in many parts of the world, disclosing about yourself is rather selfish and considered to be inappropriate. So all kinds of treatments that focus on self-disclosure, independence, etc., are basically treatments that depart from Western values that might not be relevant at all to people in Asian, African, South American countries.
Kindly like, share, subscribe to this podcast and share it amongst your friends. Let people know what we are trying to do. We are trying to help people. And keep listening to us. Hello everyone, welcome to Beyond the Surface podcast. Today we have really very special guests with us, Professor Theo Bouman and Professor Miriam Lommen, right? I suppose I got the pronunciations right?
You did.
Thank you. Okay, so they both are really established professors in the University of Groningen, Netherlands. They are professors of clinical psychology, and today we have asked them to be on our podcast and to we will be discussing a lot of things, but the most things will be regarding the cultural aspects of across the continents difference. What is exactly the difference? We will be discussing that in today's episode, right? So first of all, how are you doing?
We're doing great. If I'm
Absolutely.
honest. Yeah. We're really enjoying India because it's pretty different from the Netherlands.
Okay.
So we feel warmly welcomed by the people. We enjoy the lovely food, the great hospitality. So couldn't be better.
And moreover, we discuss a lot of interesting things that relates to psychology and mental health care with a lot of people who have an open mind and are willing to share their thoughts about this.
Right. Well, there's a saying here in India, which means Atiti Devo Bhava. It means that we regard the guests as devs. Devs means gods. So guests are like gods for us. So thank you for the understanding the hospitality that India has given you and
Thank you.
appreciating it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so the topic in hand is the cultural differences and the cultural differences across the continents, right? Which means that we will be discussing what exactly is the cultural difference here in India for psychology and the difference there is in Netherlands. So from that point of view, what are the real differences that you saw over here and there in Netherlands?
That's a very interesting question, and we've talked about that quite a lot actually last week because we were giving a workshop to psychology students, and it was very interesting to also talk about these cultural differences because, of course, we know a lot about the Netherlands, but we don't know that much about the Indian culture, so we really got to know a lot about it. And what really stands out is that we live in quite an individual society. And here's way more not only about the individual, but also about the family. So family plays a major role, much bigger role than in the Western society, I would say, as a whole even. And you see that also reflected in the psychopathology in the sense that when we're talking about interventions, most of the interventions that we offer are actually really focusing on the individual and less so on the family surrounding this individual. And here individuals are often also actually physically surrounded by family, more so than in the Netherlands, but they also play a major role. So I think when we think about the differences, and also one of the adaptations that we need to think about when we talk about interventions that might be effective, we have to think about how to incorporate this family social support, the family structure around an individual more in the interventions as well.
Okay. So the interventions, exactly, right? So do you have any inputs on that?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, and the more we travel, the more we become aware of that, is that if we talk about psychological treatments and interventions, most of them have been developed in the Western world. The most prominent one, the types of interventions or psychotherapies that travel around the world. And there's a great danger, and Miriam already mentioned some of the factors, there's a great danger that, for example, psychologists in India want to use treatment manuals, treatment books that have been written in the United States by United States or by European or Western European psychologists and want to apply it to the Indian situation. So the assumption is that psychopathology and that the factors that contribute to psychopathology and also are relevant for treatment, that they are kind of universal. And that is something like an assumption because we don't have empirical evidence that, for example, let me just give one tiny example, that, for example, self-disclosure is something that has been valued all across the world. In the Western world, for the past many, many decades, it's considered to be very healthy to disclose about yourself. If something's on your chest, and sometimes people feel it literally on their chest, if something on the chest, you have to get rid of it. Whereas in large parts of the world, and maybe even in most parts of the world, disclosing about yourself is kind of putting a burden on your family, on your community. So in many parts of the world, disclosing about yourself is rather selfish and considered to be inappropriate. So all kinds of treatments that focus on self-disclosure, independence, etc., are basically treatments that depart from Western values that might not be relevant at all to people in Asian, African, South American countries.
So the main theme that I can understand from what you have said is that we need to be inclusive and need to provide a cultural based intervention. Would I be right?
Yeah, sure.
And I think what also has been shown is that whenever we try to use a treatment which has been developed in a Western country and use it in a non-Western country, that those treatments where they actually look at the cultural differences and incorporated those, so adapted the treatment to the cultural context, that the treatments are actually slightly more effective than if we don't, if we only do like the very superficial adjustments, like language. I mean, that's a very obvious one, right. But it doesn't change anything really about your content or the way you explain things. So another aspect that we kind of tend to forget and don't really address in our Western treatments is religion. So religion seems to be a separate thing for us. Like, we don't really incorporate it in the treatments, whereas there's also some really nice examples out there where they show that you can incorporate religious beliefs or spirituality within the treatments, and that seems to be works like better for certain contexts, because you take into account people's values and you can explain certain concepts better if you use things like, for example, text from the Quran to explain something, then which people relate to, and something that's really, very different for them or not really close to the cultural setting.
I believe that answers the question that what are exactly the spiritual or religious context that should be brought into the therapy, and how it can actually exactly help, right? Do you think that answers that question, or should we add more to it?
Well, that's an interesting point, because spirituality and religion are rather broad concepts, and so what to do with it? Because we also know from empirical research that religion might also have the opposite effect, like putting people deeper into misery because of, let's say, feelings of guilt that might emerge from religion.
It's really mixed feelings.
Yeah.
Really.
So we have a lot of examples from the Western world where, in some parts of Christianity, there is a huge emphasis on guilt. Makes people feel even worse if they're already depressed. That's the one side, and the other side is including spirituality and or religion also means that the person's individual, collective, and higher values are incorporated in treatment. So it basically makes treatment more relevant and more inclusive. So the inclusivity is very important.
Because what we tend to do is we try to fit the treatment or include at least the values of the patient, right? But we need to know their values, and we also, it's very helpful if we want to treat somebody to understand what their own explanations of their problems are, their own explanations of their psychopathology, because that might also give us some guidance on where the solutions might be, or which at least we should take into account, right? So I think that's important to want to understand what the patient's thoughts are about why they are having symptoms and what their explanations behind it are, in order to also have a clear communication about that and adjust it. Not so much, how can I say it right? So to have a good connection to the patient and to make things work, because if you don't understand each other, because you have a very different background of understanding things, then it's hard to get a common view and to work together towards something.
To even be an effective therapist.
Exactly, yeah. I think so.
So what should be what problems do the therapist should address while giving a culturally appropriate therapy? What do you think should be the
I think it starts with just asking more about their own explanations and about their own wishes. The patient's own explanations. Yeah, the explanations of the symptoms.
The explanatory model.
Yeah, but also about their thoughts about what they think is needed in order to get better. Okay. And of course, it doesn't say that that's actually a solution, but it is something that you need to communicate, right? And you need to understand as a therapist what is their way of thinking in order to also find out where the two of you can go, because it's a process. Like treatment is a process, so you go together and And the therapist is the expert in psychology, but the patient is the expert on him or herself.
Focusing more on the therapist, so therefore you already mentioned the word inclusivity. The therapist should also be inclusive in their own head. Understanding that people are different on the one hand and to be understood on the other hand. It means that you should be aware of the differences, for example, in religious, in cultural, in traditional respect. Because if you just stick to your own frame of reference, then the end result is that the patient should comply with your frame of reference. And that's basically the other way around. Because a therapist from ancient Greek means servant, so the therapist is supposed to serve the patient. So have to take a step towards the patient rather than the patient having to comply with all the words and frameworks of the therapist. So that's why therapists should also be aware of the cultural, religious, and all the things that you already mentioned. It also means that if you are, for example, a psychologist or psychological therapist in India, that you should not blindly copy the textbook from the Western world, because then you fall into the pitfall of the same thing that some Western therapists do, and neglecting or ignoring, purposeful or not purposeful, the differences in people. People are different from you. So if you don't understand it, and if you're not open to it, then you never can be an effective therapist.
So what I can understand is, to be an effective therapist, first of all, you need to understand the patient's background. That also includes the patient's culture, where they're coming from, their religion, even if they subscribe to the idea of spirituality or not, right? And then planning the treatment accordingly. Would that be the right thing to summarize it?
Interestingly, that's the right thing to summarize it, because it doesn't mean that you have to invent totally new treatments. It doesn't also mean that you just should abandon treatments that have been proven to be effective in the Western world. The thing is to keep an eye on the things that already work, but to modify them. For example, Miriam and myself are very much into cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can make a strong case that cognitive behavioral therapy and the mechanisms behind it might be relatively universal. The content might be culturally attuned. So, for example, there is a lot of research being done, and I'm not quite sure about India, but in Islamic countries, for example, where the Quran, Miriam already mentioned that, was used as part of cognitive behavioral treatment.
And just to illustrate principles.
It has a spiritual element in it, so that, for example, and I can assume that the same will apply to Hindus, to Sikhs, to people with other religious denominations. To give an example, like somebody who is suffering from social anxiety disorder is very preoccupied with people judging negatively upon him or her. And they also judge themselves negative. A more religious approach would be not that I should not judge myself negative, but something like, who am I to judge myself in a negative way, because God is the only one who will be judging me. And that is rather not so much horizontal, but it's more a vertical approach. And for some clients, that's more convincing than focusing on the individual, independent, secular approach. So that's making a step towards patients rather than patients having to comply with the CBT model that has been invented in the Western world.
Exactly.
So it can be done. And
so it's really the principles then also stay alive, right? They're still there. The same principles, and they seem to be quite universal. But the packaging, the way you bring it, the way you explain things, that is really, I think, really important, that it fits with the background and also the beliefs of the person you're actually treating. And even within certain kind of religious groups, there might be different beliefs about things. So I think with each individual, that's important to pay attention to.
And an important thing also might be, and so that is on a cognitive level, on a behavioral level, it might be very important for people to carry out their religious rituals. Sometimes, and you can incorporate it in, for example, in CBT, in cognitive behavioral therapy, sometimes you can use these rituals as a closure of a certain period in their lives, which is also generally accepted as the raison d'être for these rituals, but you can incorporate them. Okay. So it makes
more sense to
it makes more sense. It makes more sense to the people, and it also means that you don't have to throw it overboard, but you can incorporate it and make it more understandable for people. But because you basically work within the framework with the cognitive behavioral theory in mind. But you don't have to push it further. You don't have to sell that in, let's say, the Western words.
What I can understand is that a certain amount or a limited amount of experiment can be done with the already established principles that are there in the field of psychology and in the therapy, of course. But my prime question is, if there is such amount of experiment, would it still stay effective? Are there accurate studies that say that it has been done before, or it can be done, or it should be done?
You mean cultural adaptation?
Cultural adaptation, and
yeah, there are several studies carried out across the world, quite a lot of them in the United States. And so there should also be more studies being done in non-Western countries, and I think India will be a great field of study. But a series of studies over the past 2 decades, meta-analysis, so studies of studies, show that if you include cultural elements in cognitive behavioral therapy and also in some other therapies, that these therapies are more effective in reducing psychopathology than if you don't include the cultural elements that are relevant for the people with the cultural background that report to the psychologist. So that is empirical evidence. It's not an opinion.
Okay, it has already been established.
Yeah, okay. But not enough been done.
It can also be explored further. Maybe this can be a thing to research for the Indians as well, the psychologists who are watching and listening to us right now.
Yeah,
I think it's very important to do more research in the countries where we don't have a lot of research going on.
Okay. All right. So, what factors are there that actually contribute to, the effectively carrying out these therapies?
There's a lot of factors involved.
Well, you mentioned 2, I mentioned 2.
Where shall
and then we leave the other 25 out.
I even find it hard to actually pick one out. And let me think. So I think one of the most important things to look at is that you have a good combination of taking into account the evidence that's out there, the scientific evidence, then combined, as you just said, with the values, preferences, belief systems of the patient, plus your own clinical expertise. And those 3 should inform you what's actually the best thing to do. And whenever you're only relying on 1 or 2 of these, I think you're making a mistake. So I think best clinical practice, which like these 3 pillars are called evidence-based mental health. And that means you need to take these 3 pillars into account when you're making decisions. So I think that's where it comes down to from my perspective.
There's also another perspective when it comes to, let's say, the need for culturally adapting, modifying treatments. And that also consists of 3 elements. So we're very fond of 3 elements. A treatment should be acceptable for the patient. So if you explain what the treatment is, the patient should be able to find this in line with their own values and preferences. For example, if you ask patients things to do that clash with their religious beliefs, I wouldn't even, for example, in order to experiment with lots of control, try to drink a lot of alcohol. If that clashes with your religious belief, of course, it's not a good idea. But more in general, for example, the focus on individuality might preclude acceptability by the patient. So treatment should be acceptable. The other thing, and that almost relates to societal, economic, and political issues, is accessibility. If treatments are not accessible or very limited accessible for people who are in need, then this leads to a widening of the treatment gap. So the amount of people who need treatment and people who actually get treatment. And in developing countries and in non-Western countries, the treatment gap might be even up to 90 or more than 90%. So 90% of the people who are suffering from some disorder don't get treatment at all. And the remaining 10% sometimes get treatment that is not super effective, because effectiveness is the third part. So treatment should also be effective in reducing, let's say, suffering in general. So it's acceptability, accessibility, and effectiveness.
Well, this also effectively answers my question that what should be the respectful and sensitive ways that therapists should use in which he should deliver his therapy or his treatment. And one thing I liked that you said, that the accessibility of the mental health resources, how it should be done, you have explained it already. But I want to ask, this is, I think, the main focus on our podcast, that what are actually the real ways or the real points in which the accessibility of mental health differs from India and Netherlands, right? I can start and converse from the point of India, and you can converse from the point of Netherlands, and then we can compare and come to the conclusion. Yeah.
Well, there are a few things, of course. For one, better than we do, the population of India is huge. The amount of psychologists and psychiatrists is relatively low if you compare the population to healthcare provider ratio. You can find it in the WHO yearly reports. Compared to the Netherlands, where in a population of only 18 million people, we got thousands and thousands of clinical psychologists, tens of thousands psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, etc. So there the ratio, the human resources are far richer than in India. So that's one thing. The other thing is healthcare insurance, because you might have a lot of people available, but if the people who are suffering can't afford it because they have to pay it from their own pockets, accessibility is low. So these kind of things contribute. And in the Netherlands, mandatory healthcare insurance system where everybody has to have a healthcare policy. And from that, a lot of healthcare, including mental healthcare, has been paid.
Oh, okay. So the insurance covers all of the medical expenses. Let's just suppose if a person gets ill over there, so they just need to go to a hospital and maybe have an insurance card or something.
Or have a kind of a stepped care model. Whenever you're suffering from something, whether it's medical or psychological, you go and see your GP. So the GP in this case acts as the gatekeeper. Then your GP can give you a referral. And when you get a referral, the cost will be reimbursed. So we pay monthly, and everybody pays monthly. And there's an extra, I think, a few €100 that you pay a year. It's like what's the word again? Your own risk. Yeah, it's your own contribution that you pay yearly. But once you're through that, all the costs are covered. So no matter how high they get. And they get to usually first do basic mental health care. And you get a number of sessions there. If that's not sufficient, you get a referral to the specialized mental health care. And there is even more care available. So that means using a stepped care model, it means that the people who can recover from the mental problems relatively easily don't end up in the specialized healthcare. So it's more efficient, the mental health care. Even though I have to say that we have a lot of waiting lists, especially for specialized care. But at least, not everybody goes directly to the specialized care, which helps to reduce the waiting list.
Waiting means exactly?
Waiting list is that you've been referred to by your GP, by your family doctor, to a psychologist, but the psychologist has such a caseload that it takes some time before you can be accepted as patient, because the other ones have to, let's say, get better, improve, or get out of the caseload.
So it means that insurance cover most of the things over there.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, here in India, the things are a little different. There are different types of insurance that a person can avail to. Mostly private insurance companies provide that. And after the Mental Health Act of 2017, it has now been mandated by the government that all the insurance companies now also need to include the mental health coverage in that.
So that's relatively new.
That is relatively new. That is not something that very old, of 5 to 6 years ago, 6-7 years ago. But then again, instead of having nothing, we are still getting something. We are getting to a point where we are getting inclusive of all the mental health disorders and the physical illnesses, because we cannot see the mental illness and physical illness as different criteria. With a different criteria, we need to include that into one thing. Having said that, I want to ask you, while it is the better way to ask this would be, are there any cultural differences or cultural norms that are related, or maybe a national thing that leads a policymaker to include various disorders into an insurance list, or maybe provide them into a healthcare facility?
So for us, I think we could say our system kind of follows the DSM-5. So whatever disorder is in there, it will be covered. And we don't really make a difference in that sense that some of the disorders are not covered or are covered. I think there's one exception. I think for specific phobia, they stopped covering that.
For work-related problems and for relationship
problems as well. That's right. That's also not covered. So there's a few exceptions, but most disorders from the DSM-5 actually, that's usually covered.
But your question was about the cultural thing, huh? And I think the cultural thing comes into play when, for example, it's not totally clear how many people are suffering from a certain disorder, so meaning the prevalence. And that might be caused by many causes. For example, and that's a big thing that might be slightly different between our countries, that's stigma. Both other stigma as well as self-stigma. And stigma means, or implies basically, that people hide their problems for other people because they are ashamed and, well, everything that comes with stigma. And also, for example, families don't want to disclose that one of the family members is suffering from, let's say, psychotic episodes, because that's rather intrusive and that would kind of a negative effect on the family. So that means, as a consequence, that disorder numbers might be underestimated. We saw this, for example, when it comes to suicide deaths, which is a very sensitive topic, also in India, with all recent changes in the penal code, etc. But we found, for example, we read in the report from the National Crime Records Bureau that, for example, in the state of Bihar, it was 0.6 people per lakhs that committed suicides. 0.6 in comparison to Kerala, where it was 28 people per lakhs people in a year. So that's a totally different number. So the thing is, why does it happen? And it's not easy to explain this, but you might think of things like social economic circumstances, but certainly you might think of stigma, underreporting.
And what we also found, some research was actually done on the attitudes towards suicide, and they showed that especially in India compared to a few other countries, they had specifically negative attitudes towards suicide, in the sense is that people see it as something shameful. Also, if a family member would commit suicide, is something to be very ashamed of. And that makes it very difficult, of course, for people who have suicidal ideations to even discuss it. So we actually had these discussions with our students as well. And they also said, well, it is something shameful. You don't easily talk to family members, even though family members are such an important part of your life and they provide most social support. But then apparently there's so much shame and stigma around it that you won't disclose any psychological problems, especially not these topics that have even bigger stigma around them, like suicidal ideation, suicide thoughts, right? So that's probably, I mean, it doesn't really put things on the agenda, right? If nobody talks about it, then it also doesn't get onto the political agenda, probably doesn't get covered by insurance, these kind of things, because people think it's non-existent, right?
And that's one of the cultural aspects related to mental health care.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a severe impact.
And it also means that one of the things that is really needed in the country, and not only here, of course, but I think everywhere, because everywhere there's still stigma around mental health disorders, is that we need to, have attention for mental health problems without problematizing, normal deviations, but to educate people what mental disorders are and what you can do about it and how we can talk about it, so we can also prevent it from getting worse, right? Because if people don't feel like you can talk about it, they can't get the support, and social support is a very important factor in the development of disorders as well. If they can't get that support, there's a higher likelihood that the symptoms will get worse over time. And if they don't seek support, some people might recover on their own, but for a lot of people, they will just continue until it kind of is so visible for the environment that it's already too far, actually. And that's just a shame for the people themselves also, in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, so in a few words, it's about mental health advocacy, and so community education, so to speak. Community includes not only the members of the public, but also policymakers, to mention just a few. So that's educating people who are not suffering from anything, potentially. The other level is what's called secondary prevention. It means that people who are at risk, for example, young people who are under stress in their educational system, to provide them with the knowledge and the tools to prevent them from developing into more complicated cases. So there also education and providing people with tools and coping strategies is super important. And number three, tertiary prevention means that it should actually have information, education and coping skills for people who already ran into trouble. For example, people who are addicted to drugs, something that is very, let's say, prevalent here in Punjab. So addressing all these different, let's say, types of people, so to speak, contribute. So that's also why your series here is very important, contributing to disseminating knowledge about mental health in general, mental health care, mental health treatments, and the wider context.
Okay. Well, what I can understand is you have talked about social support, you have talked about stigma, and other things as well. We on our podcast have been very vocal about social support. So we have been asking our guests and even the audiences that even if you have a friend, even a family member, just talk to them, talk about your problem. Even if you don't get a solution, you will get this thing out of your system, and maybe they can help you get a more systemized treatment, or they can help you get a systemized treatment. And well, of course, there are so many other social things that our society is currently suffering uh, with substances and other things. And but at the end of the day, the major thing says social support. That we need to seek social support. We need to talk to one another. We need to take care of that. And this is how we can take care of the people who might be suffering with mental health disorders.
Absolutely.
And this is one very robust risk factor as well. Right. So the lack of social support has shown to be associated with the onset of disorders, mostly affective disorders, and anxiety disorders, also the maintenance of it. But of course, it's not the only factor. We can't solve everything with social support, but it's definitely something that will help.
Maybe it can be an initial thing that can lead to a better treatment. Could be.
Yeah, it would definitely help. I mean, we also know from even when you are in therapy, we also becoming more aware, even in the West, becoming more aware that involving family and involving people who you live with or close ones, to involve them in therapy is also very important, because then also they can support you going through the whole process of therapy, right? So there again, you also see that social support is actually better acknowledged nowadays than it used to be.
Right. The major point that you have talked about is stigma, right? I want to talk about stigma from various many aspects. I want you to explain what are the reasons why stigma still exists, and I don't know, will continue to exist, and what should we do to eradicate? Maybe you can talk from the point of Netherlands, and I can talk from the point of India, why it exists, and let's compare the reasons.
Oh, that's
interesting. Very interesting, very difficult question for which we don't have any final answers, but some indicators. I think stigma relates, it's from the ancient Greek, it means that you have some kind of sign. So it means that you are kind of tarnished. It means that you're different. And because we are social beings, being different means that you are being frowned upon. People think, different, what is going on, what's wrong? Because difference is wrong. It's not better, but it's wrong. So people are stigmatized, they got this kind of stamp on their forehead, and that means that there is ample opportunity for all kind of assumptions about this. One of the assumptions, for example, related to people with psychotic disorder is that they are violent. That is something you see in the movies, and you see these people with this rolling eyes, with a machete running around, etc. It's a psychotic neighbor. In reality, people with psychotic experiences are almost always the victim of violence rather than the perpetrator. But this whole story and the narrative around psychosis, that these are dangerous, crazy people. So if that is part of the folklore, then it kind of repeats itself and people start believing, because if you repeat something over and over again, people start believing as if it's true. So that's how, let's say, stigma starts, or what the background of stigma is and how it persists.
I indeed think that we as human beings are not always tolerant towards deviations. And
that's inclusivity again.
Yeah. And then the other thing that might play a role is that we all want to be happy, and what might play a role here more so than in the Netherlands perhaps is that parents have very high expectations of their children, so they need to excel, or they hope, they expect their children to excel, and that also puts a lot of pressure on them. So it feels like probably letting other people down, letting your parents down if you do not fit that picture. So in that sense, it might feel like a failure when you are suffering from symptoms like depression or kind of psychological symptoms. So I think that also might play a role in some, like, getting mental problems into an area of shame, right? And shame is very highly related to stigma, I think, very often.
And shame is very much related to hiding. So then you hide, even etymologically, and the word shame comes from some kind of ancient word, means to hide. So, I mean, how evident is that?
Right.
So, and if you hide for yourself, for example, you can't acknowledge that you are somebody with a problem. So you won't tell anybody about it, because it
you
might
won't
also
get the
burden
support. You
one
won't
thing
seek
is
support.
you don't get support,
Mm.
and the upside, relative upside, is that you also don't burden your family. So it's a kind of a balancing between support and burden.
But that is the perspective of oneself, right? Who might be suffering with something else. That why to burden my family, or to give any kind of negative thing to my family, and why to bring them down with me, right? Yeah. Well, interestingly, sir, you have brought the point of shame that is related to hiding, right? In Indian society, people are very protective of their reputation, right? So hiding things and not letting anyone know that a person might be suffering from something else like anxiety, stress, or something like that. Maybe this can be the core idea behind that, because they are very protective of their reputation. They want to be a reputable person in a society, and they want to be respected and all. In the pursuit of that respect, maybe the stigmatization happens because they don't want to be seen as different from the from the society that they currently live in, and that brings in the idea of shame and the idea of stigma.
I also think, sorry, can I add one thing? Because I also think that pops in mind, but I think it's also related to weakness.
Right.
Because how often do you see, like, people who you see as very strong, who also have, show psychological symptoms? I think one of the reasons also why it's stigmatized is because it's seen as a weakness, right?
It can be. It can be a contributing factor, because no one wants to be seen themselves as a lower part of a society, or maybe weak, or maybe seen that they cannot do or accomplish things, right? Maybe, okay, this is something that we can discuss upon. Is stigma a kind of defense mechanism brought by a family member, or maybe a person who might be in contact with a person who might be suffering with a mental health disorder? Defense mechanism in sense, unconsciously thinking that maybe if I let people know, they would be thinking less of us. Can it be, or can it not be, or is this proposition completely wrong?
I'm not quite sure if we don't talking about the same kind of stigma, the same definition of stigma. So that would be more like shame. So keeping things away from other people in order to hide, in order to kind of keep up appearances. And stigma would be something like that. Other people would consider you to be a less valuable, or a bad person, or a weak person. So that is basically, it's not hiding, but it's putting a stamp on your head like you're not okay. That is stigma. And if this stigma imposed by others is internalized, and you consider yourself as a bad, or a weak, or invaluable, or non-valuable person, and that is self-stigma. So it has a negative connotation about people. Somebody is not okay. It could be bad, even from a religious or spiritual point of view. It could be weak if you look at competition kind of societies or anything like that, or unfit, for example, unfit to marry and to procreate. So a lot of things might be related to stigma.
So Darwin was right.
There are also people who thought that Darwin missed it altogether, but anyway. Yeah.
Maybe survival of the fittest there is a relative thing.
Well, sometimes people say actually deviations also actually leading very important and are actually leading to be stronger. Like it turns out that people actually it makes them even stronger than
Darwin was right.
Maybe he was right. Who knows?
Yeah.
I don't think it only goes in one direction, so to speak.
So now let's move towards the next question. And next domain would be about the scalable interventions, right? So I want to know what are the steps that are being taken to curb this problem that we have in hand in both the countries. We'll talk from both the countries' perspectives.
Very interesting point that you're raising there, and I think there's really quite some work ongoing now, and especially, for example, by the WHO, but also more research into the area where the focus is really on developing scalable interventions. And with scalable intervention, we mean interventions that can be set out in countries where there's not a lot of like a whole mental health system in place. So one of the ways, so you want to reach a large group of people relatively easily and quickly, right? So one of the ways to do that, and it has been done now and shown to be quite effective, is to train lay people. So you train lay people in relatively short time to provide healthcare, mental healthcare, or mental health support, I would say. And that's mostly for people who are suffering from some symptoms, but really didn't go on to have full disorders yet, but are suffering from struggling with some psychological problems. And then, by training lay people, and they can then train other lay people, you can imagine that can spread very easily. And you have way more, you don't need to rely on those few psychologists or have to fly in psychologists, which doesn't really work either, right? But you can reach a lot of people within the country where the mental health professionals are quite scarce.
The scalability also implies, in that sense, task shifting. So it shifts some tasks from psychologists and psychiatrists to lay people, mental health nurses, etc. It also requires that the treatment, in order to be scalable, is something that can be easily transferred to other people. So it should also be trainable. Some psychologists are very fond of psychodynamic treatments invented by Sigmund Freud in Vienna in the end of the 19th century, so maybe not totally appropriate in India. But if you want to make something scalable, it should not be so complicated that you need years and years of training. So it needs to be compact, it needs to be trainable, it needs to be doable, and then comes task shifting into play. It should also be something that can be carried out by people with a lesser degree of education, of training. They are well trained, with all respect, but they are not very expensive psychiatrists, very expensive and rare psychiatrists, or relatively expensive and also rare psychologists.
I have a tangential question over here. So, tradition or spirituality or religion has main component of providing people with faith, right? People who practice a religion have prescribed to like priests, pundits, or any other things like that. would it be the same thing going to priest, or would it mean something else entirely in this case? Or
So
maybe
I think without almost talking about religious healers or religious, and that's different, I think, what we would say as scalable interventions. So with scalable interventions, perhaps we can train a priest to deliver some kind of intervention. But usually we're talking about quite protocolized 5-session interventions, for example, 10-session interventions. A uses protocol. So it's it is really coming from a psychological background. So if we talk about it, we can definitely, I think, what will be very interesting and might be definitely interesting to include is have to culturally adapt that protocol. We might want to ask that priest how to culturally adapt it to incorporate his religious beliefs, for example. But I think we do make a distinction when we talk about scalable interventions. It's different from you just relying on the religious healers, for example, that are already in the country.
On the one hand, and on the other hand, it's very important that, let's say, psychologists, psychiatrists find ways to collaborate with religious leaders, with traditional healers, because these treatments can be complementary, and as we already discussed earlier,
Absolutely.
it's also something that ties in with the lived experience of the people who need treatment, because if they are religious, they find worth in religious leaders. So excluding them from the treatment trajectory would, I think, be a strategic mistake. The thing is, on the other hand, what would be the role of a religious leader or a traditional healer? It would be very confusing for a patient, and maybe not very effective, that the psychologist is one story, the religious leader is another story, with conflicting elements, and then it's confusion to the max. There are enough experiences, but not very well documented across the world, that, let's say, mainstream psychologists are working together with religious leaders. Sometimes, because, for example, in case of severe depression, people might have religious connotations to their depression because they feel not a good person. Then it's not upon the psychologist to solve that problem, but some person might find counsel with the religious leader in order to solve the religious aspect of his depressive suffering. So then religion plays part in the psychological resolution of depression.
And I think could also be, I think there might be a strong role for religion in dealing with also more the common stressors before it actually gets to psychopathology. So what I mean is that we might find those coping mechanisms within their religion, how to deal with stress before it gets to the point of disorder. But I mean, this is where the literature says like how religion can also be a protective factor, right? But there's mixed evidence, right? As we talked about before, there's mixed evidence. So you find sometimes it's a protective factor, sometimes it's not. But I could see how it could be a protective factor in that sense.
So, whatever floats the boat, we need to take those interventions. Right? Okay. I want to ask you, as we were discussing the scalable interventions, I want to ask you, how do cultural inclusivity adds upon and helps in increasing the scalable interventions?
Yeah, if you look, for example, at the scalable interventions that are provided and also available through the website of WHO, you will find them in all kinds of languages, but they also adapted to content somewhat. I mean, it comes down to the same techniques, the same things that you do, but the examples they use, the illustrations that are used to explain the material are culturally adapted. So I think that is important, again, that, you know, the level to which you're culturally adapted might be something to discuss, right? but you definitely need some depth of cultural adaptation in order to make it work for the group you're working with.
You just mentioned inclusivity, huh?
Yes.
As a very important aspect. So it also means that, as we discussed before, that if you develop or if you deliver treatments, that they again should be acceptable for people with different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, like ethnic backgrounds, like gender-related backgrounds, and whatever. Because in many treatments, or the theory behind the treatment, there are implicit assumptions about mankind, sometimes favoring one aspect of mankind over the other, so it's not very inclusive. So one of the things that scholars should do is to think deeply about the implicit assumptions in treatments. The emphasis on independence and autonomy in CBT, for example, is something that might not be shared by large parts of the world, so that it's something to rethink. And also in many treatments, at least classical treatments and the old treatments like that have been developed 50 years ago, there is something like, let's say, a kind of prejudice against women and a kind of favoritism for males. If you look at Freud's theory on psychoanalysis, is not super female friendly, so can't be considered to be super inclusive. And there are a lot of these kind of things, sometimes excluding people with specific experiences. People who experience voices or whatever are considered to be crazy, whereas that's not necessarily the case, because there's a lot of research showing that 9 out of 10 people who hear voices are functioning perfectly normal. So hearing voices is not a psychotic symptom. It might be, but it's not standard part and parcel. It's a cultural thing, and in some cultures, if you hear voices or if you see things that other people are not seeing, you're considered to be on the highest level. And in other cultures, on the lowest level.
But I think we often assume like something, what we have and what we see in psychopathology, we have a disorder, that we don't see that in people without a disorder. Whereas in reality, it's always in the dimension, right? So a lot of symptoms is just more about severity, and sometimes not even, sometimes it's about, it happens all the time with everybody, but just some people really get impaired by it. So it's also about the level of impairment that it causes, and if it doesn't cause impairment, then you might not consider it as pathological, right? But then it doesn't mean that that symptom itself is pathological. So it's sometimes just what it does to you, rather than that symptom itself might be prevalent in almost all of us.
Right.
Interestingly, for example, there's some relatively new term that popped up recently as neurodivergent. I'm not quite sure if it's a cover-up for all kinds of misery people can experience, but at least for some point, it kind of relates to the fact that people are different in the way they respond to external stimuli, etc. Some people are easily distracted, some people are easily upset, some people can't concentrate, whatever kind of thing. Some people are very focused on one thing, for example, this microphone, and they can't get their attention away from it. They're formally called things like autism or ADHD or whatever. So currently the mild forms are, as far as I understand, called neurodivergent. And there's also a tendency to accept and include people with neurodivergent characteristics in jobs or in education or whatever, which is an interesting inclusivity promoting action. So the terms, as Miriam already mentioned about the dimensions, I mean, it's either you're functioning okay or you're not functioning okay. There's a whole dimension, and the gray area in between, that's where it is. So how okay should you be in order to be a valuable member of society? And who is that to judge?
That's probably not something that can be laid down in one dimension.
Right.
Absolutely not.
So we cannot see everything from one lens primarily, right? We need different lenses in different cases, which means we need, if I were to take it as metaphorically, it simply means that we need to be more culturally inclusive and need to provide interventions that are that would be more suitable, to be precise.
Yeah.
Right?
And maybe more inclusive in general, right? And then we can include culturally inclusive, but just inclusive in general, I think would be also good.
Right. Okay, I want to ask, are there strategies for designing interventions that can easily be scaled and tailored to meet the diverse needs of individuals?
That's a good question. I mean, it takes a bit of work usually. Well, on the one hand, it takes a lot of work to read if you want to protocolise something, right? But there's a lot of things that you could do within individuals. Is that just asking people about their beliefs, about their ideas, about their cultural values, about all of that. Just asking about it already gives you an opportunity to make it more inclusive. If you look at it at a small scale, right? If you really want to develop interventions that are culturally adapted and you want to make it into a protocol, then I think you need to work on a kind of like bottom up. So you want to work together with people from the society who are actually living in the country where you're going to provide, or in a culture or a subculture you want to include and you want to adapt to, and ask them, especially, what would work and what would not work. What would needs to be adapted to make this acceptable for this group of people, right? And they will probably be able to point out exactly, like, this doesn't really relate to us at all. We don't really say it like this. We don't really do it like this. So they will be able to tell you that. And that is a matter of like sit together and talk about how can we then differ it, like make it different that actually fits with the ideas and the beliefs of the people here, and still containing those effective mechanisms.
And in fact, this answers to the catchphrase of patient participation. Rather than psychologists developing things and then selling it to patients, so to speak, it's about patient participation. So the people who are, let's say, at the center and who are basically the criterion for any kind of treatment are patients. So why not include them? Why not ask them? And it looks like an open door, but it's very often forgotten. And from the patient perspective, I'm dealing with patient perspective every now and again in my professional life, and and indeed it's great fun because you learn quite a lot of things. But what their mantra is, nothing about us without us. We are
again, because you say, and with the patient perspective, it's like, every now and then I'm a patient. Sorry.
From my patient.
Sorry.
Okay.
So let's redo that question.
No, that's completely fine. We need to have some fun altogether. I cannot even put that in bloopers. That is completely fine. Okay.
It's a very lengthy 20 minutes, eh?
Indeed.
We can go on easily for the next 20 hours.
We need to. We'll record more podcasts if we have to. Okay. As ma'am said, she has said a very brilliant thing. She said that we're using the bottom-up approach, right? I believe mental health professionals quite usually use the bottom-up approach in treating a client, and government, and on the other hand, use this top-down approach to make resources available to the people, mental health professionals, and to even doctors as well. I want to ask you, to make our society more healthier, what should be the right approach to it from both the ends? Is it absolutely right in which the direction in which we are going?
It's a big question.
Bottom up and top down. Bottom up, one of the things is that patients and other relevant parties, stakeholders, should become more vocal. So that's the opposite of shame and stigma and hiding. So it should become apparent that people might not be happy under certain circumstances, what this unhappiness is. Unhappiness from, let's say, from mild depression to schizophrenia and psychosis and whatever. So it should become more focused, so bottom up voice. And mental health advocacy is one strategy that is a very effective thing. Been proven all across the world to be relatively effective. Thereby you could influence the several layers in society. Top down, an important thing is that government should realize that in order to have a healthy population, it requires an investment in healthcare, and particularly in mental health care. If you look worldwide, the percentage of the gross national product is below 1% generally. So that is near to nothing. If you compare this to defense or to education, far larger proportions. So when we talk about healthcare, somatic healthcare, so that's already, well, undervalued in a way, but under somatic healthcare, there is the niche of mental healthcare. And it's almost a negligible part of the gross national product.
And also, I think a lot of persons already realize, like governments might not realize if they invest in it. And in the end, it's more cost effective, right? Because if you don't treat psychological disorders, it's going to be very costly for society. Not only for the individual, but also for society. Absolutely. Yeah.
From an economic perspective, it's loss of labor potential. Very simple. If people are sitting at home being addicted or depressed or suffering from psychosis untreated, that is misery on an individual level, it's misery on a family level, but it's also a cost on the societal level. Because there is the cost for treatment, etc., either psychological therapies or medication or anything else. There is loss of labor force. So financially, it's loss if you don't treat.
And just imagine that partially we can prevent it, and partially we can treat it effectively. So it's really a loss not to invest in mental health care.
And the cost-effectiveness models show regularly that if you have this investment in early detection and early intervention, so let's say secondary prevention, then the costs that you actually are saving are much larger than the relatively small investments that you make.
So you have to do some long-term reasoning, right?
Long-term reasoning about, right?
Invest on the short term in order to get gains at the long term. But this is usually not the way that
economics works.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Or maybe this is not the way government thinks.
It's because you don't earn money, you spend less money, and that's less visible than if you earn money.
Right, because it is not visible upfront.
Exactly.
No, not upfront, and even not in the midterms.
It's in the long run.
That's the thing. And of course, it's being promoted by lack of awareness and lack of knowledge by people who are making policies. Because they don't hear too much about it. People are hiding this, shame, stigma, etc., then it just looks as if there is no problem.
It's not
Whereas
on the agenda.
there is.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
mean, treatment gap, prevalence of mental disorders, it's huge.
Maybe government should fund more startups. Talking from that economic purposes, they should fund more startups and should put more funds over there. It can actually help, right?
That would be one option. That would be one option. Startups in many different ways when it comes to mental health care. And
also research, I think, is very important, of course. That we know what we're doing is evidence that what we do is effective. Because there's a lot that we start with the best intentions, but it doesn't always say that we are working most efficiently or effectively.
And that's the end of the story, and the treatment outcome studies. But before that, as you already mentioned, research into what people actually need. So needs assessment. That's quite common in humanitarian disasters, but it's also something that should be done in mental health care. So needs assessment, what do people need? If you're living in the midst of Rajasthan, in a rural area, you need different things than if you are living in a huge apartment building in Mumbai. I mean, it's evident, but what exactly do people need? So that kind of research, might be qualitative research, even quantitative research, but that is research that kind of informs the cultural adaptation or even the development of treatments.
Well, the reason why I brought startups into the conversation was because I'm also working on a startup. It is called Cognify Health. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to connect mental health professionals with clients, people who might not be suffering with very high degree of disorders, and to prevent them, we have come up with a solution that we'll be providing counseling and we'll be providing them support online. So people who need support or need help regarding mental health, they can go to cognify.io and they can use our website, they can use our platform, register over there, and of course we'll try to help you. You're not alone. We'll try to help you. Well, that would be the end of the podcast, sir, ma'am. And I really thank you for coming on the podcast, giving your time and sharing thoughts on the cultural aspects of psychology across the continents. From Netherlands and India, we have discovered and pondered upon so many questions, and you have given so many answers that include, well, most of everything. Well, thank you so much. With this, thank you. With this, we'll wrap this podcast. Kindly like, share, subscribe to this podcast, and share it amongst your friends. Let people know what we are trying to do. We are trying to help people, and keep listening to us. Have a good day. Have a good time ahead. Bye bye. Last wishes.
Last wishes. First wishes.
That's good.
For today or for life?
In general.
In general.
What's the sound?
It is sort of that profound.
Oh, okay. That is great. But it's but wishes? Any wishes? Any wishes?
I got everything I want.
I think we're perfectly
But
happy.
anyway, no, but
What about you?
I believe I want to live. That is my last wish.
I agree with that. Me too.
It should be.
I think we are a common wish.
it sounds a bit like a first wish, because if it's your last wish, I would. It sounds a bit
that's a technical
contradictory.
issue. That is a technical issue.
Oh,
Okay.
That's
don't
very clever.
underestimate the interest.
Really very clever. Thank you. Okay. I'll say 3, 2, 1. I'll take a 2-second pause and we'll start recording, right?
Maybe every now and again, in order to avoid us just talking simultaneously, so maybe every now and again you could say, what do you think about this, Miriam, or whatever.
All right.
Every now and again for the.
Not too often. No, because then I feel pressure to have to say something like it. So it's easier not to. Because then we will see how.
What is your deepest thoughts about this, Miriam? Well, not much
I don't
really.
understand. I'll pass it on to Theo.
And I
Right?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, my hair. The camera was running, or should we do it again?